The small apartment smelled of cheap laundry detergent and the faint, lingering scent of Reagan's vanilla perfume, a stark contrast to the grease and cardboard that clung to Aiden's work clothes. It was a quiet, domestic picture at 2 a.m., right up until the screen of her phone lit up on the nightstand, casting a harsh blue glow over her sleeping face. "He's at the warehouse all night, right? Come let me in," the message read, a jagged crack in their fragile foundation. Aiden didn't wake her, didn't scream. He simply picked up his worn canvas duffel bag and stepped backward into the shadows. If the quiet sound of a breaking heart draws you in, stay with me. There are more secrets hiding in the dark, and you won't want to leave before the truth comes out. The neon sign from the liquor store across the street flickered in a steady, rhythmic pulse, painting the cramped living room in alternating shades of sickly orange and deep shadow. Aiden Davis stood perfectly still in the center of the room, his steel-toed boots heavy against the worn linoleum. The apartment smelled of the life they had built together: stale coffee, the vanilla lotion Reagan loved, and the underlying dampness of an old Chicago building that no amount of scrubbing could erase. It was 2:14 a.m. Aiden wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be on forklift duty at the Regional Logistics Center, moving pallets of frozen goods until the sun came up. That was the routine. 60 hours a week, time and a half on weekends. He dragged his exhausted body through the dark so they could make rent, so Reagan wouldn't have to pick up extra shifts at the Sterling Cut, where she spent her days smiling at people who tipped well, but treated her like furniture. But a blown transformer had plunged the entire industrial park into darkness, and management had sent the night crew home. He hadn't called, he hadn't texted, he had just wanted to slip into bed, wrap his aching arms around his wife, and sleep. From the bedroom, a soft, buzzing vibration broke the silence. Aiden walked toward the half-open door, his footsteps habitually light. Reagan was asleep, curled on her side, the duvet kicked off one shoulder. She looked peaceful, her dark hair fanning across the pillow. On the nightstand, her phone vibrated again. The screen lit up, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He didn't mean to look. It was a reflex to check the time. But the notification banner was bold, stark against the lock screen. "Greg, Aston Gr. He's at the warehouse all night, right? Come down and let me in." Aiden stared at the glowing words. The neon light outside blinked. Orange, shadow, orange, shadow. He waited for the rush of adrenaline, for the blinding, red-hot fury that movies promised a man in this situation. It didn't come. Instead, there was only a cold, hollow sensation, like stepping off a ledge in the dark. Greg, the slick guy with the expensive cologne Reagan had complained about months ago. The same guy she had stopped complaining about entirely in the last few weeks. Aiden looked down at his own hands, calloused, rough, permanently stained with machine grease. He had been so tired lately, too tired to ask about her day, too tired to notice the new perfume, or the way she guarded her phone, or the extra inventory nights she had been working. He knew he had been a ghost in his own marriage, a roommate who paid half the bills and slept when the sun was up. He owned his part of the distance. But this, bringing another man to their door while she thought he was breaking his back for them. The phone went dark. Aiden didn't wake her. He didn't demand an explanation that would only end in tears and hollow apologies. The truth was already screaming in the quiet room. Moving with mechanical precision, he walked to the closet. He pulled down his faded canvas duffel bag, 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, work socks, his shaving kit. He zipped it shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the still apartment, but Reagan only shifted in her sleep, sighing softly. He walked into the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath his boots. He reached into his pocket and placed his house keys on the cheap Formica counter. Beside them, he slipped the simple gold band off his left ring finger. It clinked against the keys, a sharp final note. Aiden picked up his bag, opened the front door, and stepped out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing the apartment, the betrayal, and the last 5 years of his life inside. The Chicago wind at 3 in the morning was unforgiving, slicing through the thin denim of Aiden's jacket as he walked toward the transit station. He did not look back at the brick walk-up. He kept his eyes fixed on the cracked pavement, his boots moving in a steady, rhythmic march that felt more like a retreat. The canvas duffel bag slung over his shoulder held nothing but the barest necessities, yet it felt heavier with every block. By the time he reached the Greyhound terminal downtown, the adrenaline had faded into a dull, hollow ache. The station was a cavern of buzzing fluorescent lights and transient souls, people sleeping on molded plastic chairs, waiting for a way out. Aiden walked up to the ticket counter. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his pocket and counted out the cash he had been saving for a car repair. One way east, Aiden told the tired clerk behind the glass. Ohio, the furthest town this covers. With a paper ticket clutched in his rough hand, Aiden sat on a bench near the boarding gates. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket. The screen lit up, displaying a lock-screen photo from 3 years ago. Reagan laughing at Navy Pier, the wind blowing her dark hair across her smiling face. It felt like looking at a stranger. He unlocked the device, bypassing the gallery, and went straight to the settings. He initiated a factory reset, watching the loading bar erase their history. Every text, every anniversary photo, every shared calendar event. When the screen went black, Aiden used the edge of a stray paperclip he found on the floor to pop the SIM card tray. He took out the tiny chip, staring at it for a fraction of a second, before snapping it cleanly in half. He tossed the plastic pieces into a nearby trash can, dropped the wiped phone into the donation bin by the door, and boarded the idling bus. As the air brakes hissed and the vehicle pulled out into the dark interstate, Aiden leaned his head against the cold glass, closing his eyes to the city he would never see again. Miles away, the morning sun sliced through the cheap blinds of the apartment, casting harsh, geometric shadows across the bed. Reagan woke with a soft groan, tangling her hands in the duvet. She reached out instinctively, her palms sweeping across the mattress beside her. It was cold. That wasn't entirely unusual. Aiden's shifts often ran late, or he would fall asleep on the couch if his back was acting up from lifting pallets. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, checking her phone. There was a lingering text from Greg from 2 a.m., which she quickly swiped away, a familiar knot of guilt and thrill tightening in her stomach. But there was nothing from Aiden. No, on my way home, or leftover pizza is in the fridge. Aiden? She called out, her voice raspy with sleep. The apartment answered with absolute silence. There was no hum of the coffee maker, no muffled sounds of the television. Frowning, Reagan kicked off the blankets and padded barefoot out of the bedroom. The living room was empty. The bathroom door was open, the shower bone dry. She walked into the kitchen, intending to start the kettle, when her eyes caught a metallic glint on the Formica counter. She stopped breathing. Resting perfectly in the center of the island were Aiden's house keys, and right beside them, catching the morning light, was his plain gold wedding band. Reagan's heart slammed against her ribs. Her hands began to tremble as she reached out, her fingertips brushing the cold metal of the ring. It was heavy, undeniable. Panic flared in her chest, sharp and suffocating. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed his number. She waited for the dial tone, praying to hear the familiar ring coming from the couch cushions or the bedroom. Instead, a sterile, automated voice filled the quiet kitchen. The number you have reached is not in service. Please check the number and try again. Reagan lowered the phone, staring at the gold band on the counter. The silence of the apartment no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a grave. Reagan sat perfectly still on the kitchen stool, the automated voice from the phone still echoing in her ears long after the call had ended. The apartment was profoundly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. She looked down at the Formica counter, the house keys, the gold band. They sat there like evidence at a crime scene. Her mind scrambled for a logical explanation, a lifeline to pull her out of the rising tide of panic. Aiden's phone was broken. He was angry about something else. He had gone for a walk to cool off. But Aiden was not a man of theatrical gestures. He did not storm out, and he certainly did not leave his wedding ring behind over a petty argument. With trembling fingers, she pulled up the contact for the regional logistics center. She had only called it twice in 5 years, once when he forgot his lunch, and once when his mother passed away. A gruff, tired voice answered on the second ring. "Dispatch. Hi, I'm looking for Aiden Davis. Is he still on the floor?" Reagan asked, her voice cracking. The man on the other end sighed. "Nobody is on the floor, lady. Transformer blew out the grid at midnight. Whole night crew got sent home by 1:30. The line went dead." Reagan slowly lowered the phone. 1:30. She calculated the drive from the industrial park to their apartment. 20 minutes. 8:30 with traffic. He would have walked through the front door right around 2 in the morning. Her chest tightened as a sickening wave of nausea washed over her. She opened her message history with Greg. The timestamp on his text, the one asking her to come down and let him in, glared at her. 2 a.m. Aiden had been here. He had stood in their bedroom, in the dark, and he had seen it. Reagan pushed herself off the stool, her legs feeling like lead, and practically ran to the bedroom closet. She threw open the bifold doors. The shelf where he kept his faded canvas duffel bag was empty. She dropped to her knees, sweeping her hands across the floor. His heavy work boots were gone. She scrambled to the master bathroom and yanked open the medicine cabinet. His toothbrush, his razor, the cheap shaving cream he bought in bulk, all gone. He hadn't thrown anything. He hadn't punched a wall, hadn't woken her up to scream or demand an explanation. He had simply excised himself from her life, with the precision of a surgeon cutting out a tumor. Hours bled into the afternoon. Reagan remained curled on the edge of the unmade bed, wrapped in the duvet, staring at the empty space on the nightstand where his phone charger used to be. The silence of the apartment was no longer just an absence of noise. It was an entity, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on her lungs. She wanted him to burst through the door, red-faced and furious. She wanted a fight. A fight meant there was still something to salvage, a tether connecting them, however frayed. But this absolute erasure offered nothing. It was a punishment far more agonizing than any words he could have spoken. The screen of her phone lit up against the tangled sheets, vibrating violently against the mattress. Her breath caught. She lunged for it, praying for an unknown number, for any sign of him. "Greg," asked Em. "Hey, beautiful, you ghosting me? See you at the shift at 4. Wear the red lipstick." Reagan stared at the words, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips, before dissolving into a ragged sob. She was drowning, her marriage reduced to ash by her own hands, and the man she had burned it down for was treating it like a casual Tuesday. She locked the phone and buried her face in her hands, entirely alone in the echoing void she had created. The ambient lighting of the Sterling cut was meticulously designed to flatter, warm amber bulbs bouncing off polished mahogany and brass fixtures, creating a cocoon of exclusivity for Chicago's elite. At 4:30 p.m., the pre-shift hum was a symphony of clinking silver, the sharp hiss of the espresso machine, and the rich, heavy scent of dry-aged beef. Reagan stood in the employee restroom, gripping the edges of the cold porcelain sink until her knuckles turned white. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. She had applied the red lipstick Greg had texted her about. It did not make her feel beautiful or desired. It felt like a brand, a garish smear of guilt across her pale face. Aiden is gone. The thought looped in her mind, a skipping record playing over the terrifying silence he had left behind in their apartment. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She had simply zipped up her tailored black supervisor uniform and walked to the train, operating on a sickening, hollow autopilot. Taking a jagged breath, she pushed through the swinging door and stepped out onto the floor. The immediate, chaotic rush of the dining room offered a brief distraction. "There she is," a low voice murmured near the main POS station. Reagan stiffened. Greg leaned casually against the oak counter, a reservation tablet in one hand. He looked effortlessly sharp in his custom-tailored suit, wearing the arrogant smirk of a man who believed the world revolved around his convenience. As she approached to review the seating chart, he shifted closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You look incredible," he said. His hand reached out, casually brushing the small of her back, hidden from the main dining floor by the towering hostess stand. "Didn't hear from you today. Was starting to think you were feeling guilty." The casualness of his touch, which had once felt like a thrilling, dangerous secret, now sent a violent wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. She stepped away instantly, breaking the contact. "Don't do that here," she muttered, her voice trembling slightly. Greg's smirk faltered, replaced by a quick flash of irritation. "Relax, Reagan. The old man isn't even on the floor yet. What's with the attitude? Your husband finally figure out you're bored to death." He meant it as a joke, a cynical jab at the man whose grueling schedule they had been exploiting for months. But the words struck Reagan like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She looked at Greg, truly looked at him. The expensive cologne, the perfectly styled hair, the absolute lack of substance beneath the charm. For a few stolen hours of validation from this man, she had destroyed the quiet, steady devotion of a husband who had broken his back in a freezing warehouse just to keep them afloat. "Just focus on the shift, Greg," she whispered, turning her eyes back to the screen, though the names on the reservations blurred together into meaningless shapes. From the shadowed mezzanine above, Victor Sterling stood perfectly still. At 60, Victor was a fixture of the city's culinary scene, a man who commanded absolute respect through an intimidating combination of silence and impossible standards. He did not miss a crooked fork on a table, let alone a shift in the dynamics of his management staff. His sharp, slate-gray eyes were locked on the interaction by the POS station. He noted the way Reagan had flinched. He noted the proprietary, entirely unprofessional way Greg had leaned into her space. Victor despised workplace romances, viewing them as a rot that compromised the integrity and focus of his establishment. But this looked worse than a romance. This looked like a liability. Reagan picked up a stack of leather-bound menus, her hands visibly shaking as she walked toward the private dining rooms to check the table settings. She was physically present, but Victor could see the absolute, hollow detachment in her eyes, the look of someone watching their own life burn to the ground from behind a pane of glass. Victor adjusted the cuffs of his blazer, his expression hardening into something cold and calculating. He didn't know the specifics yet, but he was a patient man, and the cracks in their facade were already beginning to show. The scent of old frying oil and stale coffee permeated everything in the diner, clinging to the walls, the vinyl booths, and the pores of Aiden's skin. It was a different kind of grime than the metallic, freezing grease of the Chicago logistics warehouse. Here, off a rain-slicked interstate in rural Ohio, the grime was warm, repetitive, and entirely anonymous. Aiden stood in the cramped back kitchen, rhythmically bringing a heavy chef's knife down on a pile of yellow onions. The repetitive motion was meditative. Chop, slide, chop, slide. For $10 an hour, paid in cash at the end of every week by a gruff owner named Mel, who didn't ask for a last name or a social security number, Aiden chopped vegetables, hauled sacks of potatoes, and scrubbed the flat-top grill until it gleamed. He had been here for 8 days. 8 days of cheap motels, instant coffee, and a silence so complete it sometimes made his ears ring. He scraped the diced onions into a large steel prep bowl and reached for another batch. His shoulders ached, a familiar deep tissue burn that had been his constant companion for years. But for the first time, the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the mental loop playing in his head. As the rain lashed against the small, grease-stained window above the sink, his mind drifted back to the apartment in Chicago. Not to the glowing screen of her phone. He had forced that image into a dark corner of his brain, but to the months leading up to it. He remembered walking through the front door at 3 in the morning, his hands numb from the freezing warehouse, seeing Reagan asleep on the couch with a book on her chest. He remembered the times she had tried to stay awake for him, brewing tea, asking about his shift. And he remembered his own responses, short, exhausted mumbles before collapsing into bed. He had been so focused on survival, on paying the rent and keeping them afloat, that he had stopped seeing her. He hadn't noticed when she stopped buying the expensive coffee they used to share on Sunday mornings. He hadn't noticed when she started wearing her hair up differently, or when the quiet dinners they managed to share turned into silent, obligatory routines. He had built a fortress to protect them from poverty, but he had walled himself in and left her outside. Aiden paused, resting the heavy knife on the cutting board. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the steel prep table. The truth was a bitter pill to swallow, rough and abrasive against his pride. His exhaustion had laid the foundation for the distance between them. He owned that. He would carry the guilt of his neglect for the rest of his life. But as a truck rumbled past the diner, rattling the cheap window panes, his jaw tightened. He had been absent, yes, but he had not been treacherous. He had not sought comfort in the arms of someone else, while his partner broke their back in the freezing dark. She had made a choice, a series of choices, really, to invite another man into the sacred, fragile space they had built. She had let Greg into their life, into their home, into the very survival he had sacrificed his youth for. "Hey, new guy!" Mel's gravelly voice shouted through the pass-through window, breaking the heavy silence. "Need those onions for the chili. Let's move." "Coming," Aiden called back, his voice hoarse from disuse. He wiped his hands on his stained apron, picked up the heavy steel bowl, and walked toward the line. The past was a burned-down house, and there was nothing left to salvage from the ashes. Here, in the rainy anonymity of Ohio, he was no one's husband, no one's provider, and no one's fool. He was just a pair of hands, working in the dark, finally free. The Friday night dinner rush at the Sterling Cut was usually a meticulously choreographed ballet. Tonight, however, the rhythm felt jagged, at least to Reagan. The clinking of crystal wine glasses and the low, murmuring jazz did nothing to drown out the deafening roar of her own anxiety. It had been 2 weeks since Aiden vanished. 2 weeks of automated voicemail greetings, dead ends, and a cavernous, terrifying silence in their apartment. Standing near the mahogany host stand, Reagan forced a rigid smile as she handed a leather-bound menu to a VIP guest. Her eyes, shadowed from consecutive nights of insomnia, darted instinctively to the glowing screen of the reservation tablet. She wasn't checking table availability. She was desperately waiting for a digital notification that would never come. "Stop looking at the screen like it's going to bite you," a voice murmured near her ear. Reagan flinched. Greg slid into the space beside her, far too close for the main dining floor. He smelled of his signature heavy cologne and an expensive Cabernet. He held a clipboard, but his eyes were roaming over her with a lazy, entitled possession that made her skin crawl. "I'm working, Greg," Reagan whispered, her voice tight, stepping an inch to her left to re-establish a professional boundary. Greg sighed, an exaggerated sound of profound inconvenience. "You've been a ghost all week. It's getting old, Reagan. Your husband finally took a hint and cleared out. You should be celebrating, not sulking like a widow." The sheer callousness of his words struck her like a physical blow. She looked at him, the polished veneer of the man she had risked everything for, stripping away to reveal something deeply ugly and hollow. He didn't care about the devastation she was drowning in. He only cared that his private entertainment had become complicated. Before Reagan could formulate a response, Greg casually slipped his hand into his suit jacket pocket, revealing the corked neck of a 2015 vintage Bordeaux, a bottle reserved exclusively for the private cellar inventory. 10 minutes, Greg muttered, his tone shifting from irritated to demanding. "Meet me in the reserve room. I already killed the security feed for that corner." He didn't wait for an answer, turning on his heel and disappearing down the dimly lit corridor that led to the private dining and storage areas. Reagan stood frozen, her stomach twisting into a sickening knot. The reserve room was strictly off-limits during service. It was reckless, it was arrogant, and it was exactly the kind of careless behavior that would get them both destroyed. From the elevated mezzanine that overlooked the main dining floor, Victor Sterling stood in the shadows, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. He had seen the interaction. He hadn't heard the words, but the body language was a broadcast Victor had learned to read decades ago. He saw the slight recoil in Reagan's posture, the aggressive lean of Greg's shoulders, and the inappropriate proximity that violated every standard of his establishment. Victor slowly retrieved a slim silver tablet from the inner pocket of his tailored blazer. He opened the real-time inventory software, his slate-gray eyes scanning the logs. A bottle of 2015 Bordeaux had just been marked as damaged in the system by an administrative override. Greg's override. A cold, calculating stillness settled over Victor. He did not believe in public shouting matches or dramatic scenes on the floor of his restaurant. He believed in absolute, surgical precision. The rot had clearly spread deeper than a mere illicit workplace romance. It was now bleeding into the integrity of his business. Victor tapped the screen, locking the inventory log and flagging the security system's blind spots. He watched Reagan hesitate by the host stand for a long, agonizing moment before she finally lowered her head, defeated, and began walking toward the corridor Greg had vanished into. They thought they were invisible in the dark. Victor adjusted his cuffs, his expression entirely unreadable. He would let them think that for just a little while longer, right until he pulled the floor out from under them entirely. The administrative office of the Sterling Cut sat suspended above the main dining room like a watchtower, heavily soundproofed against the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation below. Inside, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic ticking of a brass carriage clock on the heavy mahogany desk. It was 1:00 a.m. on a Sunday. The restaurant had closed 3 hours ago, the staff had long since departed, and Victor Sterling sat in total darkness, save for the blue glare of 3 security monitors illuminating his sharp, stoic features. Victor did not believe in coincidences. He believed in patterns, in data, and in the undeniable truth of a ledger. He leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses as he typed a master override code into the security software. Greg was a clever man, but his arrogance consistently blinded him to his own limitations. Greg assumed that having assistant manager credentials meant he controlled the digital footprint of the restaurant. He did not know that Victor had installed independent, hardwired backup cameras in the high-value inventory sectors for insurance purposes just 6 months prior, cameras that bypassed the local network entirely. Victor pulled up the timeline for Friday night's dinner service. He keyed in the exact minute the 2015 Bordeaux had been logged as damaged. On the center monitor, the hallway leading to the private wine cellar appeared in stark black and white night vision. At 7:14 p.m., Greg stepped into the frame. He looked up at the primary dome camera, entered a sequence into his tablet, and smirked as the red recording light blinked off. He then unlocked the heavy oak door to the reserve room and stepped inside. Victor's face remained completely impassive. He switched his attention to the backup feed, a wide-angle lens tucked discreetly behind an HVAC vent. At 7:19 p.m., Reagan appeared. She was walking quickly, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her posture rigid, with a mixture of dread and compliance. She paused at the threshold, glancing nervously over her shoulder before slipping into the dark room. The digital clock at the bottom of the screen ticked forward. 5 minutes, 10, 20. Victor reached for a heavy crystal tumbler on his desk, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. His eyes never left the screen. He was not a moralist in his personal life, but the Sterling Cut was his sanctuary, a monument to discipline, excellence, and integrity. To use his life's work as a cheap, illicit rendezvous point during the peak hours of service was not just an insult, it was a profound violation of the standards he demanded. It was theft. Theft of company time, theft of a $1,000 bottle of wine, and theft of the establishment's reputation. At 7:51 p.m., the oak door opened again. Greg stepped out first. He was casually adjusting his tie, running a hand through his hair with a sickeningly complacent expression. He wiped his mouth, tapped his tablet to reactivate the primary camera, and walked back toward the bustling dining floor without a second glance. A full minute passed before Reagan emerged. Victor paused the playback. On the frozen frame, Reagan looked hollowed out. Her lipstick was smeared, her hair slightly disheveled, but it was the absolute, crushing emptiness in her posture that caught Victor's eye. She did not look like a woman enjoying a passionate affair. She looked like a prisoner of her own making, crushed by the gravity of a terrible, irreversible mistake. Victor felt a brief, fleeting flicker of pity, but it was instantly extinguished by his ironclad sense of order. Pity did not excuse betrayal. She was in a supervisory role. She had compromised the staff, the service, and herself. With measured precision, Victor hit the print command on his keyboard. The heavy laser printer in the corner hummed to life, spitting out high-resolution timestamps, the inventory override logs bearing Greg's digital signature, and the still frames of their entry and exit. He gathered the warm sheets of paper, aligning their edges perfectly against the mahogany desk, and slipped them into a pristine manila folder. He closed the laptop. The blue glow vanished, plunging the office into pitch black. The trap was fully set, the evidence undeniable. All that remained was to spring it. The summons came on a Monday morning, a day the Sterling Cut was closed for service. The restaurant was eerie, without the hum of conversation and the clatter of silverware, the dining floor cast in the gray, muted light of an overcast Chicago sky. Reagan sat in one of the 2 leather chairs facing Victor Sterling's heavy mahogany desk. Greg sat beside her. For once, Greg did not look smug. The unnatural silence of the building and the rigid set of Victor's jaw had finally managed to penetrate his thick armor of arrogance. Victor did not look at them immediately. He finished signing a vendor invoice with a silver fountain pen, capped it with a soft click, and set it aside. He then placed his hands flat on the desk, his slate-gray eyes moving slowly from Greg to Reagan. "Integrity," Victor began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a physical blow in the quiet room. It is a word thrown around loosely in this industry. People think it means not stealing from the register. I believe it means holding the same standard of character in the dark as you do in the light. Reagan's stomach plummeted. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Victor reached into his drawer and produced a single manila folder. He opened it, laying 3 items side by side on the polished wood. First, the administrative override log for the 2015 Bordeaux, bearing Greg's digital ID. Second, a high-resolution still frame of Greg deactivating the primary security camera. Third, a time-stamped photo of Reagan slipping into the reserve room, looking over her shoulder like a common thief. Greg shifted in his chair, the leather creaking loudly. "Victor, listen, I can explain the bottle. It was a corked vintage, and I—" "Do not insult my intelligence." Victor cut him off, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "You are a parasite, Greg. You used my establishment, my inventory, and my payroll to facilitate a tawdry, pathetic affair during peak service hours." "It was a lapse in judgment," Greg stammered, his face flushing a deep, ugly red. "You can dock my pay. I'll cover the bottle." Victor leaned back in his chair. "You will not cover the bottle because you no longer work here, and you will not work anywhere else in this city. By noon today, I will personally make a phone call to every proprietor from the Gold Coast to the West Loop. They will know exactly why you were terminated. You are a liability. You are professionally finished in Chicago." Greg opened his mouth, but the absolute coldness in Victor's eyes silenced him. The reality of the blacklist settled over him, suffocating and complete. "Leave your keys on the desk," Victor commanded softly. "Security will escort you out." Greg stood, his hands shaking slightly as he dropped his keys on the wood. He didn't look at Reagan as he turned and walked out of the office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The vacuum of silence he left behind was agonizing. Reagan kept her eyes glued to the photograph of herself. She felt entirely hollowed out, as if her bones had turned to ash. "And you?" Victor said, his attention locking onto her. Reagan swallowed hard, tears finally welling in her eyes, blurring the edges of the desk. "Mr. Sterling, save your tears," Victor said gently, though there was no warmth in his voice. "I do not care about your marital problems. I care about the fact that I placed you in a position of leadership, and you chose to compromise yourself, your staff, and my restaurant for a man who didn't even have the decency to look back at you when he walked out that door." Reagan closed her eyes. The truth of it was a physical agony, a mirror held up to the ugliest parts of her soul. "You are dismissed, Reagan, effective immediately." Victor closed the manila folder. The sound was final, definitive. Reagan stood up on trembling legs. She had traded a devoted husband and a respected career for a handful of stolen moments in the dark, and now, the lights were finally on, leaving her with absolutely nothing. The deadbolt of the apartment door clicked shut with a heavy, metallic finality. Reagan leaned her back against the cheap wood, slowly sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. She didn't turn on the lights. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, gray shadows across the small living room. It had been 4 hours since she walked out of Victor Sterling's office, but she could still feel the phantom weight of the termination folder on the desk. She looked down at her hands. They were empty. No job, no husband, no dignity. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling with a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. She walked into the kitchen and stopped at the edge of the island. Aiden's keys and his plain gold wedding band still sat on the Formica counter, right where he had left them 2 weeks ago. The dust was beginning to settle around them, a quiet testament to a life that had simply ceased to exist. From the depths of her purse on the sofa, her phone began to vibrate. The buzzing sounded unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence of the apartment. Reagan stared at the bag for a long moment before walking over. She pulled the phone out. The caller ID flashed. Clara. Reagan let out a ragged breath. She desperately needed her sister. She needed to cry, to confess that her life was falling apart, to ask if she could stay in Clara's guest room in Evanston until she figured out how to breathe again. She swiped the screen to answer, lifting the phone to her ear. "Clara, Reagan's voice broke on the first syllable. "Don't," Clara said. Her voice was not warm, it was not sympathetic. It was sharp, cold, and vibrating with a tightly coiled anger that made Reagan's breath hitch. "I just received a very interesting phone call from the Human Resources Department at the Sterling Cut," Clara continued, the words clipped and formal. They were looking for Aiden regarding your sudden termination and the cancellation of your joint health benefits. But since his number is disconnected, they defaulted to your secondary emergency contact. Reagan closed her eyes, a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. Victor Sterling had not just fired her, he had ensured the paperwork was processed with surgical, devastating transparency. They asked if I knew how to reach him, Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, heavy with disgust. And when I asked why you were terminated so abruptly, the HR representative read me the official cause on your file. Gross misconduct and inappropriate sexual relations with management during operating hours. The silence that followed was agonizing. Reagan gripped the edge of the sofa, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth, but there was no defense, no lie she could weave to soften the blow. The truth was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she couldn't pull air into her lungs. "Is it true, Reagan?" Clara demanded, her voice finally cracking. "Did you actually sleep with your manager in the restaurant?" "Clara, please," Reagan whispered, tears spilling hot and fast down her cheeks. "It was a mistake. I was so lonely, and Aiden was never here. Do not blame him for this," Clara snapped, the anger returning with a vengeance. "Aiden worked graveyard shifts in a freezing warehouse so you could keep this apartment. He worshipped you, and you threw him away for a cheap thrill in a wine cellar?" Reagan sobbed, a pathetic, broken sound. "Is that why he's gone?" Clara asked, the pieces locking into place. "Did he find out?" "I don't know," Reagan choked out. "He just left. He didn't say anything. He just left his ring and disappeared." "Good for him," Clara whispered. The words were a dagger, twisting deep into Reagan's ribs. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Reagan. Don't call me. Not for a while." The line clicked, followed by the sterile beep of a disconnected call. Reagan lowered the phone. The screen went dark, reflecting her own pale, tear-streaked face. She sank to her knees on the faded rug, pulling her knees to her chest. Victor had promised consequences, but only now did she understand the true scope of his judgment. He hadn't just taken her career, he had stripped away the shadows, forcing her to stand in the harsh, unforgiving light of her own ruin, entirely and utterly alone. The shadows in the living room lengthened as the afternoon bled into early evening, stretching across the faded rug like dark, accusatory fingers. Reagan had not moved from the floor. The chill of the hardwood slowly seeped through her clothing, but she welcomed the numbing physical discomfort. It was the only tangible sensation grounding her, keeping her from entirely dissolving into the vast, suffocating emptiness of the apartment. She slowly turned her head toward the kitchen island. Even in the dimming, ambient light filtering through the blinds, the plain gold wedding band and the metallic jaggedness of the house keys seemed to emit a dull, heavy glow. They were artifacts of a ruined civilization. For the first time since Aiden had vanished into the Chicago night, the frantic, buzzing static of panic in her mind, the desperate instinct to fix things, to smooth over the edges, to control the narrative, finally died away. It was replaced by something much heavier and infinitely more terrifying: absolute clarity. She thought about Greg. She pictured the way he had looked sitting next to her in Victor Sterling's office, small, pale, and entirely pathetic. He had been instantly willing to grovel, to throw their affair under the bus in a desperate bid to save his own skin. She had traded the quiet, enduring devotion of her husband, her hard-earned career, and her sister's respect for a man who didn't even possess the baseline courage to look her in the eye when the reckoning arrived. The memory of Greg's expensive cologne, of his entitled hands in the shadowed corners of the restaurant, no longer held any dangerous thrill. It brought only a wave of profound, choking revulsion. Reagan pushed herself up off the floor, her joints stiff, and walked with dragging steps into the bedroom. The air here felt stagnant. The bed remained unmade from the morning, a chaotic tangle of sheets on her side. On Aiden's side, the pillow was perfectly smooth, the duvet pulled tight. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, the springs groaning softly beneath her weight. If Aiden had stayed to fight that night, she would have known exactly how to navigate the wreckage. If he had stormed into the room, shouted, broken a lamp, or demanded answers, she would have had a script to follow. She could have cried. She could have pointed out his chronic absence, his bone-deep exhaustion. She could have weaponized his grueling warehouse shifts, subtly twisting the narrative until she was the tragic, neglected wife who had simply been starving for warmth. She could have begged, bargained, and used her tears to dilute the concentrated poison of her guilt. But Aiden had denied her all of it. His absolute silence was a mirror she could not look away from. By simply placing his ring on the counter and walking out the door without a single word, he had systematically stripped her of every defense mechanism, every excuse, and every rationalization. He had not punished her with anger. He had punished her by leaving her entirely alone with the unvarnished truth of what she had done. It was a flawless, devastating execution. The apartment was so profoundly quiet that she could hear the faint, distant hum of traffic on the interstate miles away, a world continuing to spin, entirely indifferent to her ruin. Reagan reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the cool, empty cotton of Aiden's pillow. The reality of her situation settled over her, cold, suffocating, and absolute. She had meticulously burned down her own life, and now she was condemned to live in the ashes. There was no one coming to save her, no one left to blame, and no way to uncross the line. Burying her face in her hands, Reagan finally broke, her heavy, agonizing sobs echoing off the bare walls of the bedroom, entirely unanswered and completely alone. It took 3 weeks of quiet, humiliating persistence to find the address. Reagan had practically begged a sympathetic clerk at the Regional Logistics Center's payroll department to give her a forwarding location for Aiden's final W-2 form. The clerk had hesitated, citing company policy, but the sheer, hollow desperation in Reagan's voice had eventually worn her down. She provided a P.O. box in a small, rural town in Ohio. It was a sterile string of numbers and a zip code, but to Reagan, it was the only piece of Aiden left in the world. She sat at the kitchen island. The spot where his house keys and gold band had rested was now empty. She had placed them in a small velvet box in her dresser drawer, unable to bear the daily visual execution they delivered. In their place was a single sheet of heavy, unlined paper and a black ink pen. Outside, a bleak November rain lashed against the apartment windows, blurring the Chicago skyline into a smear of gray and dull gold. Inside, the only sound was the scratch of the pen against the paper. Reagan's hand trembled as she wrote the date. She paused, staring at the blank expanse of white. Her instinct, honed over years of self-preservation and the toxic environment of the restaurant, was to craft a narrative. She wanted to write about the freezing nights alone in the apartment. She wanted to detail the crushing loneliness of a marriage where the other person was perpetually exhausted, too tired to look at her, too drained to hold her. She wrote the words, "I was so lonely, Aiden." She stared at the sentence for a long minute. Then, with deliberate, forceful pressure, she drew a heavy black line through it. No, that was a defense. That was the old Reagan, the woman who believed her mild dissatisfaction gave her the right to commit emotional treason. Aiden had been lonely too. He had been freezing, exhausted, and breaking his body in a concrete warehouse to keep the lights on, and he hadn't sought comfort in someone else's bed. She gripped the pen tighter and began again, forcing herself to strip away every defense, every excuse, and every plea for pity. "Aiden," she wrote, her handwriting small and deliberate. "I am not writing this to ask for you back. I know that door is closed, and I know I am the one who locked it. I am writing this because your silence made me look at exactly what I am, and I need you to know that I finally see it too. I destroyed our marriage. I was selfish, arrogant, and cruel. I took your exhaustion, which you endured for us, and I used it as an excuse to validate my own ego. I invited someone else into our life because I was weak, and I threw away a good man for absolutely nothing. You were right to leave the way you did. You owed me no explanations, no fights, and no closure. I owe you the truth. I am entirely to blame, and I will carry the weight of what I did to you for the rest of my life. I hope Ohio is quiet. I hope you get to sleep in the dark. I am so sorry. Reagan." She didn't read it over. If she did, she knew she would lose the nerve to send it. She folded the paper with exact, rigid creases, slipped it into a plain white envelope, and wrote out the P.O. box address. She grabbed her coat, not bothering with an umbrella, and walked out of the apartment building. The rain was freezing, biting through her thin sweater as she walked 2 blocks down to the corner mailbox. The rusted blue metal was wet and cold under her fingers as she pulled the handle down. Reagan looked at the envelope in her hand one last time. It contained her entire ruined life, distilled into a few lines of ink. She let it slip from her fingers. It dropped into the dark void of the box with a soft, definitive thud. She let go of the handle, the metal door snapping shut with a sharp clang that echoed over the traffic, finally setting him free. The frost on the windshield of Aiden's second-hand truck was thick, requiring a solid 5 minutes with a plastic scraper before he could see the road. Ohio in November was bitterly cold, but it was a clean, biting chill, different from the damp, suffocating wind off Lake Michigan that seemed to seep directly into the bone. Aiden pulled into the gravel lot of the local post office just past 7 in the morning. He walked inside, the bell above the door jingling with a cheerful, rustic sound that he had slowly grown accustomed to. He twisted the small brass key into his P.O. box, expecting nothing more than a utility bill or a local circular. Instead, resting flat against the metal bottom, was a single, plain white envelope. Aiden pulled it out. There was no return address, but he didn't need one. The neat, deliberate loops of the cursive handwriting struck him with the force of a physical blow. The air in his lungs momentarily stalled. Even hundreds of miles away, completely erased from her digital and physical world, the sight of his own name written in Reagan's hand sent a profound, aching jolt through his chest. He didn't open it in the post office. He walked back to his truck, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots, and drove the 2 miles back to his small, one-bedroom apartment above a hardware store. The apartment was sparse: a hand-me-down sofa, a small television he rarely turned on, and a square wooden dining table. It was quiet. It was entirely his. Aiden sat at the table, a steaming mug of black coffee resting near his elbow. He stared at the envelope for a long time. The instinct to tear it to pieces unread was strong, a defensive flare of pride, but he was tired of running from ghosts. With a slow, steady breath, he slid his thumb under the seal and pulled out the single sheet of heavy paper. He read the words in the silence of the morning. "I am not writing this to ask for you back. I destroyed our marriage. I took your exhaustion, and I used it as an excuse. I owe you the truth. I am entirely to blame." Aiden read the letter twice. He waited for the blinding rage to return, for the deep, suffocating betrayal of that night in Chicago to rise up and choke him. But as he looked at her unvarnished confession, the sharp edges of his anger seemed to dull. She had not made excuses. She had not tried to manipulate the narrative to save her own conscience. For the first time since the night he walked out, he felt the heavy, invisible armor he had been wearing slowly begin to crack and fall away. She had finally seen him. She had seen the freezing warehouse, the grinding exhaustion, and the silent sacrifices he had laid at her feet. But more importantly, she had finally seen herself. Aiden leaned back in his wooden chair, the wood creaking in the quiet room. A phantom ache radiated in his chest, a mourning for the girl he had married, for the life they had tried to build, and for the tragic, stupid way it had all burned down. The sting of what they had lost was still there, and perhaps a small part of it always would be. It was a permanent scar, but a scar was not an open wound. It did not bleed. He picked up his coffee mug and took a slow sip, letting the bitter heat ground him in the present. He looked at the letter one last time. It was a profound tragedy, a perfectly articulated apology, and a definitive goodbye. Aiden stood up from the table. He didn't fetch a lighter to burn it in some dramatic display of vengeance, nor did he fold it carefully to hide in a drawer. He simply walked over to the small aluminum trash can beneath the kitchen sink and let the paper slip from his fingers. It fluttered down, landing softly among the coffee grounds and eggshells. It was just paper. He washed his mug, dried his hands on a faded towel, and grabbed his keys from the counter. Walking out the door, Aiden locked the deadbolt behind him and stepped down the wooden stairs into the blinding, freezing light of the Ohio morning. The air was crisp, his lungs were clear, and as he walked toward his truck to begin his shift, he realized, with a profound and absolute certainty, that he was finally free.